Hello, and welcome to Call to the Workforce, a professional and leadership development podcast where we are interviewing LDS women about their experience in the workforce and what they've learned about leadership in a community or volunteer church and family setting. I am your host, Emily Chipman, and today we are going to be talking to Lauren Williams about working with people from different cultures and also dealing with the perceptions that other people have of us. Essentially, how do we advocate for ourselves and show our strengths? Lauren, welcome to the show.
Hi, Emily. Glad to be here.
I am excited to have you here. And let's do a brief intro to Lauren that really highlights why she's going to be talking with us about these topics. So, Lauren attended Georgetown University, where she received a bachelor's in marketing and international business. She later received a master's degree in information systems from the University of Utah. She completed a certificate in leadership excellence through American Express's employee partnership with Harvard. And professionally, she has worked, I geek out over this, she worked for the National Geographic Society.
Oh, God.
She also worked for American Express, focusing on consumer marketing and operations. In 2018, she switched careers and went into product management. She's worked at Lendio and most recently at Regions Bank. And fun fact for you, Lauren has been to 48 countries. She is a very active Georgetown alum and probably one of the best champions I have ever met. I noticed when I went to LinkedIn and looked at her profile that almost every comment is her championing another person. And I think that sets us up so well for this conversation of advocating for ourselves and seeing the good in other people. So, Lauren, you've got an international business degree and you've worked internationally. You've worked for a global company here in the United States. You've done a ton of travel. What have you learned about working with people from different cultures?
Great question. Thanks for that awesome intro. Makes me sound, sometimes I'm like, it makes me sound better than I actually am. I forget about some of those things about myself. I have always loved, I've always been interested in people, other cultures, other languages, differences in maybe the way that I grew up or what I perceive. But as I've been around the world, as I've worked with people from other cultures, things that are very seemingly different, maybe on the outside and the way that people think or do things in their lives, like we are really all the same. We have the same hopes and dreams and desires. And it's just a reminder to me that we really are all children of God. So I've loved being able to go around the world with that perspective. And sometimes those things that seem different at first may be challenging or maybe lead to like, I don't even want to engage with that. But I have really had a good time trying to get to know people for who they are, despite these differences kind of on the outside. So that's been really fun for me.
Can you give us an example? Because I work with people who, and I think a lot of us work with people where really our economy and the workforce is really becoming more global.
Mm-hmm.
And people from different cultures do have different perspectives. And then we're on Zoom. So can you give us an example of maybe how you've seen challenges, but then maybe been able to work through them or discovered
Sure,
paths forward?
sure. I remember working with a particular colleague at one company, and she was in an Asian country, and sometimes Asian cultures are very different from the American cultures that we grew up in and operate in. And maybe it wasn't so much necessarily a cultural difference, but I was just so frustrated with this woman and like the way that she thought, or I felt like I answered questions over and over again. And maybe I did chalk it up to cultural differences, but I could not figure out how to get through to her. I talked to her on a regular basis. I attempted, like, do I need to get on the phone with her? She's not getting it through email. And, I'm working with a time difference here too. So as I'm leaving work, like, she's coming into work. So it's often difficult to connect. I just had a really hard time with that. and this was even like pre-Zoom days, like before that was the thing. And like I love remote work and I think people can be super effective from home, but um luckily for better or worse, like I went on a trip to this country and it wasn't until we connected in person and she took me around her country to eat like the amazing food that it's known for that we were able to then connect kind of on this personal level, and I was able to get to know her um better, and I just had fresh eyes when I interacted with her. And like, yeah, sometimes things were still a little frustrating on projects that we were working on, but I just had a new appreciation for her after we were able to connect. I was able to get to know her in person, understand where she's coming from. So I like Zoom's great, remote work can be great, but I really am still about that in person connection to overcome some of these differences that we don't always realize are there when we're trying to connect from long distances or asynchronously. So,
Something that's so interesting to me about what you're sharing is that the thing that really made the difference was getting to know her as a person.
mhm,
And
yeah,
I'm curious for you because we aren't always able to fly out to, I'll throw out a country here, Zimbabwe,
sure.
you know, because so what can we do to get to know people personally over Zoom? Have you ever had that experience of saying like, okay, I'm not going to be able to go out, so
Right.
what can I do to start bridging this gap and getting to know them more
Yeah,
personally?
yeah. I think that was hard. I started with a company at the beginning of the pandemic, and I think everyone thought, oh, we're all going home with the relationships that we already have. We're just going to have these meetings on Zoom. And I didn't really see any companies do a really good job of like, no, we have to pivot the way that we work and talk to each other. And I was starting as a new employee, I was onboarding, I was not plugged into their culture. I didn't know anyone. I missed like walking by people's desks and seeing a picture of their family or their pet or whatever. Like all of that is lost in the water cooler talk. So, I mean, I think for me, just what's been helpful is like every time you have a meeting, um, even before you meet with people, like just have a 15-minute like, hey, can I get to know you as a person? Can we just like chat and remember things about them and try to reference that through conversations? Or every time I start a Zoom meeting, I mean, some people do like, here's a fun fact, let's all laugh, or like that can sometimes feel cheesy, but I like to just have a minute and talk about like how are people actually doing, and hopefully people warm up and are willing to share across Zoom before you jump straight, and don't jump straight into your business topic of conversation. But it's really
Yeah.
important. It's really important.
It stands out to me that what you're doing is humanizing the person
Yeah,
instead of looking at the culture. You're actually
yeah,
taking time to know them as an individual.
sure, yeah.
So you have some other, I think, interesting experience or a slightly different perspective on culture from the perspective of product
Mm-hmm.
because you work with, and I see this when I work with people, that when I work with someone from, say, finance, there's oftentimes, not always, kind of an approach within a company of
Mm-hmm.
what's happening and how they like to approach things in finance, which may be very different than how the very creative marketing team likes to do things. So
Mm-hmm.
you, being in product, have to work with a lot of people who may have very different approaches, even within the same company, who were raised
Yeah,
or grew up in the same country. So,
yeah,
do you have any examples of this? And is there anything you could share about how to bring the cultures that we think should work together well
sure.
together?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons I wanted to go into product. It's interesting, like you are no one's boss, but you have to get all of these different teams to work together. And I touch so many parts of the business, and I really am a translator kind of across these different groups. So it's really important for me to understand where is everyone coming from, what's their perspective, and what are they going to care about in this particular project. There's so many different audiences and updates that I'm giving across the board, and the SVP of operations. might care about one thing, but the developer that I'm working with who's building code to make something work is going to care about something very different. So how do I merge all of those things together? It's not always easy. People have often called me like a diplomat. I very much seek harmony. Diplomacy is kind of what I'm good at. So I kind of like these challenges, but I think yeah. And then, you're working with designers who are often very creative or sometimes come up with these like pie in the sky ideas, and you have to rein that back, say like it's a little bit out of scope, like maybe we'll do that later. And you've got engineers sometimes who are very literal and want like just very literal things, and how do you marry it all? But I think it really comes down to helping everyone understand like why. And there's so many books about getting to why, five whys, like asking why, but having a purpose, and kind of an overall goal helps everyone kind of stay on track. And that can be helpful, but then sometimes you still have to reframe that and like, hey, this is the why of this overall project. How does your work tie into this? And like, let's look at things from your perspective. Like, what's important to you in getting to this? And that's going to be very different kind of across teams, but we're all working towards the same goal. And you often have to repeat that. You start a project and everyone's like, great, we're all on the same page. And like a month later, you're like, oh, we've kind of lost the vision here. Like, let's go. Let's regroup. Let's remember why we're doing this. Okay, yeah. So it's a lot of repetition, but as working in product, I'm kind of the overall guider of those things. So fun but challenging.
So, can you give us an example? I love this concept of being a diplomat.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the reasons I like it is because that feels very, as I'm thinking about this, I would so much rather have someone say, you're so diplomatic, than have someone
Mm.
say, you're so political, right? Like, political is like dealing and feels like it's like
Sure.
schmoozing everybody. So, can you give us an example of how to diplomatically talk to someone or
Mm-hmm.
bring two groups together that doesn't have that political schmoozy feel to
Oh,
it?
I mean, they're still schmoozy though. Like, I was just in a really big meeting actually a couple hours ago with all of these SVPs from all of these different groups, and we're all aligned in like this one particular thing we want to do. We want to change one of our loan products and have it work a certain way, but everyone's got all these opinions about how we should do it. But I knew that going in, there were going to be a lot of different opinions. I'm trying to get to harmony and get to everyone saying yes, great, let's proceed and move forward. But um, it's individual smoozing. It's going to each of those people before the meeting. Hey, what are you concerned about? This is what we're trying to do. Let's hear it from your perspective. Great, I understand your concern. This is what I've thought about. This is how we want to address it. So by the time they get to the meeting, they are ready to say yes. And everyone's kind of like already been schmoozed, already said, oh yeah, she gets where I'm coming from. She understands what my issues are going to be. So then we can all come together and say, yep, we're good to go. So,
Yeah, caretaking.
um,
Like
yeah.
even more than schmoozing, because schmoozing to me is like, I'll buy you a cake if you.
Oh, there's
I don't.
definitely been some offers of that. Like, we get to the end of this.
Yeah,
What do you want? What do you want?
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
but
And through it all, I love that we just own that. Like, sometimes it does take a little bit of,
yeah.
I'll give you a piece of cake, right? Uh, and also, I think so much of what stands out to me is this care and that time to take that you're taking to understand where
Mm-hmm.
everyone's coming from,
Yeah.
and how to support them or get what they need out of the experience. So if
Mm-hmm.
you were to give, kind of as we think about this topic, if you were going to say there's two or three things that someone should absolutely take from what I've talked about, what are the two or three
Mm-hmm.
things that you say you got to remember this when you're working with people from different cultures?
I mean, yeah, I think you have to remember, like I do love the reminder that we are all children of God. We all want to be loved, cared for. We want meaningful connection, and relationship in our lives. So I think approaching things from that way before you say, oh, that person's terrible to work with, like take a step back. They're a child of God too. They have unique talents and differences that can be strengths. and work to get to know them on a personal level. And I think this applies to church callings as well. You know, in our church, we serve a lot in volunteer positions, and everybody's coming from different experiences and have different ways of doing it. And sometimes I've gone into things and thought, I do not want to work with this person, but I volunteered and they volunteered. We're both giving our time. We're both trying to do our best. How can I get to know them and appreciate for the efforts that they are bringing? So, yeah.
I love that. So, a lot of this conversation has to do with the perceptions we have about other people. And I want to kind of throw a hardball question your way. So, I know you've learned how to deal with the perceptions you have about others.
Mhm.
Let's talk about dealing with the perceptions others have about us. And let's just start with the challenge we've all faced: performance reviews.
They're the worst.
The, I'm going to admit that the idea, when I think about performance reviews, I actually have like a physical, anxious
Hmm.
feeling
Yeah,
still. And I haven't worked internally for almost a decade.
yeah,
They're
yeah.
challenging. Yeah.
And
So,
I don't know that I've worked anywhere that does them well. Um, it's either been really rough or like they're like, oh, we just don't do them at all. And I'm like, well, how am I supposed to know how I'm doing? I do thrive on kind of feedback and goals. So
mhm.
it's like, oh, we don't do that. I'm like, wait, what? But also then it's the flip side of like they're kind of terrible. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So, how have you managed this? Because so much of performance reviews, yes, there's measurable, and also sometimes there's perceptions that come in.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, I mean, I think I figured out pretty early on, like, especially for companies who do them once a year. I mean, and that can be any time of year, but usually mine have always been in December. I do not remember a single thing in December that I did in January, February, March. Um, no one, our memories are very poor. So I try to kind of keep, I mean, I've seen people approach this in different ways. I try to just kind of keep a high level document flowing of like, hey, these are some of the accomplishments that I met. And it could be maybe like I finished a really big project, so I want to note the successes and wins out of that. I've seen some people do it on a weekly basis of, hey, this is how I spent my time. This is what I achieved. This is where I moved the needle. This was a success that I had. I think it's also really important to remember feedback that you get from other people. And like I mentioned, I just had this big meeting a couple hours ago, and several people messaged me after and said, hey, that was a really great meeting, really good discussion. Like, thanks for your work on that. And like, I am copying and pasting that into my document so that I remember in 9 months from now when I'm trying to like fill out my annual review, like, hey, people cared and people told me I did a good job. So I'm going to remember that. And that's also a good motivator for me. I can be pretty hard on myself. I mean, even a couple weeks ago for this particular project, I was like, I hate this. Can someone else please do it? I am clearly not doing a good job. I was beating my head against the wall, but like, hey, it's a reminder. Yes, I am doing well. People are recognizing that, and I want to remember that.
So, what are some of the principles that you would share? It sounds like you track some of
Hmm.
the things that you have. What are the principles you would share about how to, like, what to track, what's good to track,
Sure.
things along those lines?
I mean, I don't think it has to be anything super difficult. I mean, it's kind of like a resume. Like a resume, you don't want to list, this was my job responsibility. Where did you move the needle? What like progress did you make? And then, yeah, feedback from other people, I think is really important too. When you're recognized by others, remember, remember that. So, yeah, I just anything. I mean, and sometimes in my job, there are ways that I can put numbers on things like, oh, I launched a thing and I saw that customer retention went up 7%. But that's often really hard to get to. So even just like smaller wins of like, hey, I worked as a team and we launched this thing and it went faster than expected and we got a lot of good feedback. Even if it didn't move the needle in a numbers way that you can, it's easily measurable, like still write it down.
You
Effort
meant
matters.
and I love that you're saying this because I'm thinking about how leadership principles can be part of all aspects of life. And you had
Hmm.
mentioned two things that as we prepared for this and talked about uh, some of the things that you felt like it could be valuable to share, there were two things that you mentioned to me that kind of made me step back for a moment and were helpful. One of which is you said everyone should be doing this, including small business owners. And it made me step back and think, oh, yeah, I
Oh yeah.
do. I had just been doing that because it's important for me to convey to clients or potential clients the impact that I have. Um,
Hmm.
and it also makes me think for anybody listening who's maybe a parent or a softball coach to keep track, like this concept of,
Yeah.
and I want to come back to this in a moment of the impact it's had. Um, But the other thing that you mentioned that I thought was so wise is you said you have to ask and say what you want.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Oh yeah. I think in terms of wanting, to move up in your career or, as a small business, if you want to raise your prices or things like that. I have never really had a boss that's like, oh, I'm going to look around and see who, seems like they want to be promoted or whatever. I mean, sometimes that happens, but if you, whether that's you want to move up in your current role, or you are interested in doing something else, maybe a lateral move to a different part of the company you're in, um, no one's really going to know that. Like you have to go ask and say, hey, I'm interested in this new role or learning this new thing. Like, how can I do that? Can you give me things to work on? Is there a class I should take to become qualified? Like, no one's going to hand you anything. You really do have to go ask for that. And I was going to say something else about performance reviews that I just remembered. A lot of times for performance reviews, and I feel like people get afraid and they're scared, like, oh, my boss is going to come back with this bad feedback or whatever. I've been very lucky that most bosses are like, I want you to write your performance review so well so that when I go in to meet with other leaders, like they're all battling out for ratings, I want to be able to advocate for you in the very best way that I can. So
Mm-hmm.
writing your review so that your boss can be an advocate for you, but that also comes back to if you want to move up, you have to go and say, I'm interested in doing this thing. Can you advocate for me? What is it that I need to do to learn, to move up, to move to a different role, to try something new? How you got to set yourself up so that someone else can advocate for you.
The line that keeps coming to my mind is advocating starts with yourself. So many
Hmm.
times we hear people say, well, I really would like someone to advocate for me. And we have to start by saying, you have to advocate for yourself. You are really
Yeah,
as you're talking about this, one of the things that stands out to me is this idea that you're really the one holding all the knowledge. Your boss didn't
yeah,
probably get copied on all those complimentary emails. You did.
right.
You have the information that you can share with your boss to really highlight these wonderful things that you're doing. So,
Hmm.
I want to talk about a scenario that none of us want to be in, yet sometimes we get in it. So we've been talking about this idea that we know who we are and we know our strengths. Sometimes, even though we know our strengths, others have a perception of us that is not complimentary or maybe isn't even fair. Have you faced
Hmm.
that? And how did you deal
Hmm.
with it using this concept of advocating for yourself?
Yeah, it's not fun to be in that. I've probably had that a couple times, but one more recently that I remember I'd been working somewhere for a while and I'd moved to a new team. And I kind of never really felt like I fit in anywhere, which is really strange for me. I've always had really good friends at work and but I just was like not connecting. I don't know what the disconnect was. I tried and I tried and I feel like I heard rumblings from other people like, oh, we don't even know what she's doing or what she's working on. And um, so I kind of started doing these like weekly emails to people, and it felt very self-promoting and kind of silly. So I was like, do these people even care? Are they even going to read this? Like, they're busy. But I was like, no, I want people to know what I have accomplished in this last week with my team. I'm working on important projects. I want them to know that I am moving the needle. So I would kind of just send this like quick little email every Friday of like, this is what I accomplished last week, and this is why you should care about it. And like it sort of turned the tide a little bit. It's very hard to come out from that, but for a while, like it turned the tide for me. And then I noticed like more people would stop me in the hallway and be like, "Hey, how are you doing?" And I'm like, "Where is this coming from?" Okay, but I mean, ultimately, I decided like, "Hey, this maybe isn't a great fit for me," and we ended up parting ways, and that's fine. But um, that was a helpful strategy for me.
I think this is just so honest of a
Yeah.
conversation. And I know I've had scenarios where I thought, man, I've had great teams before. And for some reason, this team, it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't seem to be connecting. And I remember actually on that same team, my manager, so one of the team members, apparently every week at the end of the week, he'd send an email to our manager saying, like, hey, here's some great things I did. And I'm thankful for my manager at the time who said, I want all of you to do that. And it was
Mm-hmm.
a really, so I think that there's some good in doing that. There's wisdom in what you shared about it's not just saying, I just want you to know I held an amazing meeting. You
Yeah.
had that last part about, and here's why you should care about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like we're moving the needle on this project that you're responsible for, and here's some things I've heard or that I've accomplished. So
Yeah.
I really like that loop in to what's I like that you've connected that in and helped make sure that that is part of the story, because if you only talk about yourself, it is really
Yeah.
self-aggrandizing,
Yeah.
and this is about your contribution to the business as well. So um you have had professional successes, you've had professional challenges.
Mm-hmm.
How we've talked a little bit about this earlier as you talked about how some of these lessons could be applied in volunteer settings and in callings. Um, and for those who are on video, we've now been joined by our unofficial mascot of the of the podcast,
Ruby.
Little Miss Ruby, the toy poodle, has just joined us. Um, so we're just going to roll with it because one day we're going to have a mom on the podcast, and she's going to have a kid who crawls in her lap, and we're just doing life here. So
Yeah.
uh, professionally, you have had successes, you've faced challenges. We know that these principles apply in both volunteer and personal settings. I'm curious how your faith has impacted you professionally as you have worked through some of these
Mm-hmm.
things.
Yeah. I mean, I think early on, as a teenager, it's pretty common in our faith, when you're a teenager to receive a particular blessing that can have guidance for your life. And so when I received my patriarchal blessing, it very much talks about education and career and being out in the world. And so that's kind of always been a guiding thing for me. I've always prayed a lot about where I should go to college, what should I study, what job should I take. I have seen like little miracles open doors for me, so I cannot deny that any of that was a blessing from heaven. And I mean, a lot of jobs that I've gotten have not necessarily been through traditional paths. And like, I know that wasn't me. Like, I know that things opened because I was praying and trying to figure out the right thing to do, even like moving across the country at one point. And then, like, how am I supposed to move? And how am I supposed to, like, get a moving van on this tiny street? Like, even little things like that of like little doors have opened for me to pursue that. And I think I'm like, God knows me really well. Like, He knows that I love to travel and cultures, and He's opened doors for me to be able to do that professionally, like working internationally. So, yeah, it's been a great thing for me.
So I think we talked, as we were talking about this, we talked about this idea that sometimes you're really prayerful and you end up with a spot and it's hard after you step into it. How have you
Hmm.
reconciled some of those experiences where you're like, I feel like this was where I was supposed to go, and also
Hmm.
this feels hard?
Sure. I mean, hard things aren't necessarily the wrong things. There's always a place to learn and to be refined. And I mean, I remember at one point I was living in Los Angeles and I was still working a job that I had loved, but I was miserable. I got to a point where I hated the job that I was in. I mean, I loved it for a while, and then I got to a point where I'm like, what am I doing here? I am miserable. And I remember just praying for months, like, what am I supposed to do? Um, Turns out the answer was move to Utah, which I also did not want to do. Um, but yeah, just, I mean, hard things are not necessarily the wrong things. So,
What has come what has been the outcome of having had those experiences? How has your life changed? Maybe for good, or how have they maybe been part of that learning journey and experience for you?
that's a really hard question. Will you say that again? How is my life?
How have these hard things shaped and been helpful to you?
Hmm. I mean, I think one of the things I've realized over the last couple years, like I've had hard things kind of happen in the last couple years, but I'm like, no, I can do hard things. I have done hard things. Got a pretty good track record so far, so I've been pretty happy, and I think just having those reminders that God has answered my pleadings for like, what the heck am I supposed to do with my life? Like that can still happen. So I've done hard things. I know how to do hard things. And I know that I have access to guidance that will help me.
As I think on this, I think about something that you shared about one of the volunteer experiences you've had, which was really about the importance of using your talents, the talents God has
Hmm.
given you in whatsoever circumstances that you've used.
Hmm.
And it strikes me that sometimes you're using them during tough moments and in hard moments, but that using them has created opportunities for you. Um, what what is I mean, that's something that I'm thinking about, but what are you thinking about as you think about those things?
Um, yeah, I mean, sort of back to this idea that um, God knows me and He knows my talents, He knows my interests. Um, And so I feel like I've been able to marry those interests with career, with volunteer things, and being able to share those with other people. I mean, I haven't done this in a while, but like one of my talents, at least when I was a kid, I don't do this as much anymore, but like I played the piano for a very long time. And I've kind of been able to like play the piano in kind of some fun situations and volunteer my time. I mean, when I lived in Washington, D.C., I wanted to study abroad and I wanted to go to Spain and I wanted to get really great at Spanish. And I was able to go volunteer for a church congregation that was mostly immigrants from Latin America, and they didn't have anyone to play the piano for them. So I would go play the piano every week, every Sunday, and then I got to sit and practice Spanish, and then I got to um, speak Spanish well enough to go to Spain and study and like have a great time. So just little things like that have kind of lined up for me. Um, and I've been very big on, I was a young women's leader in church for a long time, so working with all of the teenage girls. Um, and I think over the years, we've kind of heard some mixed messages maybe from religious leaders about preparing to be a wife and preparing to be a mother, but also like get an education. I've just been always very big on like with my own experience, helping them understand they should cultivate their own interests and education. And there's a lot of ways that they can get an education. Whatever circumstance you end up in, whether you are married or not, whether you have kids or not, like you can do a formal education, you can go to graduate school, or you can say, hey, I want to take a photography class that's 4 weeks at my local community college, or I want to watch a YouTube series and like watercolor on the side. Like whatever circumstance you're in, like you have talents and you have interests that you should cultivate kind of no matter what. So I've just been very big on trying to instill that in, in young women so that they can use their talent, their intellect, their brain that they have been given from God and, continue to develop that throughout their life.
So, if you were to kind of give a 2 or 3 principles about your experience of incorporating your faith or using your talents, what are some of the principles you would share with other women?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes for a long time I was like, church stuff and faith stuff is over here and career stuff is over here. And like, I didn't always connect. But back to this concept of like, God knows me and he knows my interests and he cares about all of those things. So whatever it is that you're trying to pursue in your life, faith can play a role in any and all of it. I mean, yeah, I think that's probably my overarching principle. God cares if you want to become a better photographer, or you want to learn to play the piano better, or you want to be a better parent, or you care about this work meeting that I just had that I like said a quick little prayer about, like, please don't let this go off the rails, like he cares about all of it. So there is a way to incorporate faith into whatever you like and whatever interests you have.
Well, I so much appreciate all of the wisdom that you have shared from start to end. And you have. I think about this idea, so many times we talk about multicultural differences, and I think so much of what you've talked about is honoring other people, honoring who you are as a person, both in advocating for yourself and recognizing your strengths. And then I love this additional concept that we can incorporate faith into all of the things we do, and we can use these talents. And we have a heavenly Father who, I think of the story in the Bible about the talents and using our talents
Hmm.
to do good. And maybe it's hard at times and it feels challenging, but I love that line that you shared, that hard doesn't always mean it's the wrong thing.
Hmm.
So, as we always like to do, I always like to invite someone to kind of give the final message. And I would love to know, if you were going to give a message of hope or encouragement to someone,
Hmm.
to another woman listening, or anyone who's listening, what's that sort of mic drop moment that you would give that phrase, and what's so important about it to you?
Hmm. Well, when we were talking, kind of preparing for this conversation, you said something about like, it seems that I take risks. And I don't necessarily think that I take risks. But yeah, I mean, I've moved across the country for college. I didn't know anybody. I've moved across the country for jobs. I didn't know anybody. To me, that's like maybe fun, but to other people, that might feel risky. And um, yeah, I've seen, people have come up to me and like, hey, I have a chance to maybe go do this far away, but I don't know anybody, and or to kind of take a big leap like that. And I think my overarching piece of advice that I try to still do for myself is like, you can always go back. Like wherever you are right now, you can be comfortable, you can do this. It's what you know. Take the risk, take the leap. Like you don't know what's out there. You can always come back if it doesn't work out, but you will never know if you don't actually go try something else. So go do it. There's nothing to be scared of. You can come back. It's fine. You can come back. Take the leap, go forward. Stuff will pay off, and that's how you win at life, I think.
I love it. Now I'm like, I need to take more risks. Oh, I love it. Well, I just want to thank you for joining us today, and thank you to everybody who is listening. If you have found that this is helpful or encouraging to you, please share it with others. I say this often that I really believe that this is about women sharing their wisdom, their conviction, what they've learned about leadership, and sharing it with other women so it can lift each other together as really a community effort. So if you have found that this has been helpful, please share it with others that you think it may encourage them as well. As a reminder, you can find us on all of our major platforms. Please subscribe. And if you would like reminders or notifications of when the next podcast is going to come out, you can sign up on our website at www.calltotheworkforce.com. Uh, and with that, take care, everyone, and we will see you soon.